Good evening. I'm Michael Dixon, Principal of Green Templeton College, and I'd like to offer a warm welcome to this evening's event and to those joining us online from home. This is the first of our flagship lectures, the Green Templeton Lectures, which this year explore the theme of philanthropy. Across the series, three distinguished speakers, Dr. Josh Yates, Anne Birgitte Albrechtsen, and the Right Honourable Rory Stewart, will explore whether philanthropy has a problem with evidence under the umbrella seeing is believing. We're delighted to be joined by Dr. Josh Yates for our first lecture. The series is convened by myself and Associate Fellow Caroline Greenhalgh. Caroline is Executive Director of Three-Dimensional Impact Limited, a consultancy working with funders and charities to identify sustainable and innovative solutions that are both impactful and scalable. Now, after Josh has spoken, Carolyn and Ranjit Majumdar will chair a Q&A session with Josh. They will take questions from the in-person audience and from online viewers. So if you're in the room, please do wait for a microphone to reach you so you can be heard on the recording. We would also like to hear from our online audience. So please feel free to post questions in the YouTube chat, and we'll try and alternate between questions from the audience and online. At the end of the evening, current Green Templeton College student Pallavi Menon will close this evening's event, and we think that's going to be around 7 p.m. So without further delay, let me pass over to tonight's chair, Caroline Greenhalgh. Caroline.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you to our audience, both online and in person. I'm absolutely thrilled this evening to be joined by Dr. Josh Yates, who will deliver the first lecture in this lecture series. Josh is the Executive Director of Belmont Innovation Labs for Social Impact at Belmont University in Nashville, and he is also CEO of the Thriving Cities Group. Josh brings over 2 decades of experience in academic research, community development practice, and social entrepreneurship, which will inform his lecture tonight, which is exploring the challenges and the possibilities of venture philanthropy. I'm really looking forward to hearing from Josh, and I know we're in for a stimulating and thought-provoking discussion. So without further ado, please do join me in welcoming Dr. Josh Yates.
Well, good evening. Thank you for being here, and for those who are live streaming, thank you for joining us. I'm delighted to be here tonight and to talk about the theme of this lecture series on Seeing is Believing. Does philanthropy have an evidence problem? It's a big and broad question, and I'm going to be approaching it from a very particular angle. And that angle is what you might call venture philanthropy, or better, a venture approach to philanthropy. Now, it goes by many names. There's many cognate and adjacent themes. These include social entrepreneurship, impact investing, enterprise or strategic philanthropy. They're all near each other, but slightly different ideas. And whatever we call it, I believe that it is absolutely critical as a tool and as a practice and as an approach to philanthropy to the complex and pressing challenges of our day. So, for some of you who like to skip right to the ending, well, right to the ending, there we go. Let me start with my argument. Whether you are a philanthropist, whether you are a social entrepreneur, whether you're a subject matter expert or a researcher, or just a concerned citizen, whether you are concerned about the intensifying environmental challenges of our world, whether you care about financial inclusion and accessibility in a time of increasing inequality, fill in the blank of your passionate issue. I'd like you to consider the proposition that the future of philanthropy, if it's to remain relevant, maybe even legitimate, in the decades ahead, will require more and more of this approach. And so in brief, here it is. Here's my argument. that addressing the world's most pressing challenges requires a special approach to capital, a kind that philanthropy with a venture approach is uniquely suited to offer. And the good news is that there is considerable amount of philanthropy in our world that's available to play this role, and that could be massively leveraged for impact, especially for the people and places who need it the most. And that when compared to what we will call in a second traditional philanthropy, which has its role and its place, every dollar deployed with a venture approach has, on whole, a much higher potential for long-term impact, long-term health, sustainable health for the social enterprises and nonprofits that are invested and funded, a much higher potential for systems-level impact, and even potential for financial return that can be recycled for sustainability. So that's my second point. My third point is, however, there are real challenges, one of which is the theme of this series, the question of evidence, the question of what is impact, how do we measure it? I'll talk about a few others that I think are important as well. And until we can address those, there remains a limit to how much venture philanthropy or approach to venture philanthropy is out there, which means there's a lot of money left on the sidelines. A lot of good, well-meaning philanthropy and philanthropists, or people who could become philanthropists, who were left out of the game, so to speak. But as I'll also argue, these barriers can be, and in some senses are, being overcome. So let me share a little bit about how I come to this theme and this topic. And I'll start by saying that I'm both a scholar and somebody who's spent time both in doing research as well as social practice and social entrepreneurship. And over time, I've had the privilege of working in very local contexts doing this work. I've had the privilege of doing this work in both rural and urban contexts. And over, I hate to say it now, several decades, I've come to a pretty key learning around these three questions. And these three questions have defined really all of the work that I've done. What does it mean to thrive in today's world? What does it take to thrive in today's world? And critically, who gets to thrive in today's world, right? These are questions about deeply human questions about what it means to flourish as a human being, as a community. And these are the questions that have really preoccupied me. But over the time, I think one key learning has come out over and over again to me, which is that there can be no thriving without generating pathways that dignify people and their families with good jobs and stable incomes. And that when those jobs and stable incomes are made sustainable, they generate both intergenerational and community wealth. Let me say that again. There can be no road to thriving without generating pathways that dignify people and their families with good jobs and stable incomes. And that when made sustainable, they generate both intergenerational and community wealth. So that's the thing that I keep coming back to over and over again in my work. And as I've had the great privilege and benefit of finding other people whose vocational journeys have taken them to the same place. In particular, it has brought me into partnership with an extraordinary network of people around the world that who have a loose affiliation called the Transformational Business Network. This is an extraordinary group of impact investors, venture philanthropists, social entrepreneurs, and many others. And the approach to philanthropy that I'm going to be discussing with you tonight, and many of the stories, in fact, all of the stories I will be sharing with you tonight, are drawn from the experience of this global community. All right. What is venture philanthropy, or a venture approach to philanthropy? The spoiler alert is there actually, if you look this up, if you Google it, there are lots of different sorts of definitions. There's no hard and fast definition. I'm going to offer you my definition, all right? That venture philanthropy is a high engagement approach. High engagement is a really important set of words that combines a variety of financial and non-financial resources to deliver greater social impact. And these can be resources that are invested in both non-for-profit or for-profit enterprises. But the key word is high engagement approach that combines both financial and non-financial resources to deliver greater social impact. Now, for those of you for whom these words are not all that familiar, this term venture philanthropy, I've put a distinction up here. Again, these lines are blurry, but I think it could be useful in just comparing key characteristics. So traditional philanthropy, on the whole, has tended to invest in various programs that serve immediate needs, at least in the social space of things. Here I'm leaving out things like patronage to great universities. But the kind of philanthropy that is invested in social causes and social good. They tend to focus on services and programs meeting immediate needs. They tend to measure activities and outputs. They tend to be low or modest engagement on the part of the philanthropists themselves. They tend to be acts of charitable giving where you write a check, you give it to an organization, and you hope that it does good with it. And generally speaking, the kinds of philanthropic resources that are deployed are financial with no expectation of return. And by return, I mean either the return around impact or the return, a potential financial return. And in fact, I would say we largely have a bias against thinking that philanthropy would go to anything that would have a financial return. Venture philanthropy, on the other hand, tends to invest not in programs, but in organizations, tends to not focus on immediate needs as much as addressing root causes or systems level kinds of solutions. It focuses very significantly on measuring outcomes and impacts as opposed to activities and outputs. It tends to be very high engagement, hence my definition, and it includes both grants and investments. So let me give you another way of thinking about that. So this is what we might call the continuum of capital from all the way on the left side, grants, sort of typical charity, typical philanthropy, all the way to commercial investments on the far side, all right? But traditional philanthropy tends to be in this very far left side on the continuum. Grants, primarily grant only, impact focused to a point, but generally they count impact as outputs. We were talking about this a moment ago. And that's been primarily where the bulk of philanthropy has been for most of the history of philanthropy. Venture philanthropy includes that. It includes the grant giving part, but extends it beyond to other sorts of revenue-oriented things, but all towards social impact. Basically, it's saying, well, let's extend our toolkit. Let's extend the kinds of resources we will use to empower social enterprises or nonprofits to achieve their impact. So these can include, as I mentioned, regular grant giving. They can include loans. Let's say you have a charity that wants to build a building for a new enterprise. You can use charitable donations as a loan for that building. These are called PRIs, purpose-related investments, right, to get technical. There are other forms that where foundations or charities or philanthropies can use their actual endowment money, the money they tend to invest, not give away, also for loans and for other kinds of investments. These are called mission-related investments. So there's a whole continuum of financial vehicles, increasingly, that venture philanthropy has at its disposal to support social impact. But the point here is not, the main point is not finance or revenue first. The point is social impact first. So the point of venture philanthropy is it includes traditional philanthropy and extends its capability set. Quick word about impact investing. Some of you may be familiar with impact investing and may be wondering, well, how is venture philanthropy similar or different than impact investing? Again, the dotted line is meant to show that these are very blurry lines. There is no hard and fast distinction. The way I like to think of it is where venture philanthropy will be using charitable or philanthropic money for social impact, and they'll use any tool that's available to them to advance a social impact in some area. The impact investor, that may or may not include some kind of financial return. The impact investor is always going to be concerned with doing good and doing well, always going to be concerned with having some sort of financial return. But the point I want us to think is not thinking of these as either or. In fact, I want you to understand venture philanthropy as a bridge. It is a bridge from traditional philanthropy to impact investing. It is a key that unlocks all of these resources along a continuum. So please, as you hear me talk tonight, think of this whole continuum, that this is what venture philanthropy unlocks for us in the fight, in the struggle for achieving greater social impact on the causes and challenges of our time. And I'll also mention that while this is focusing on the financial side, there is a similar kind of continuum on the non-financial side. And you'll see as I tell stories tonight how important the non-financial parts of venture philanthropy are. Just a quick slide I wanted to offer by way of saying this is a popular idea within philanthropy. This is not a new idea in philanthropy. Depending on how you date these sorts of things, it's at least a decade, maybe longer, maybe older. And there are many very large, very well familiar, large philanthropies that are very much in the game of venture philanthropy. And in fact, it's been a very fast-growing part of philanthropy. So that's important. Some even claim that we've gotten to the point now where venture philanthropy is peaked. That maybe it's sort of run its course as a fad, and now impact investing is sort of the name of the game for philanthropy. I want to argue that let's hope that neither of those are true. As good as impact investing is, we need venture philanthropy. That's what I'm going to convince you tonight. So enough with definitions. Let's get into a story, all right? So this is the story of Agape connecting people, Agape CP. This story comes to me, by the way, through the TBN Asia network. And Agape is a social enterprise based in Singapore whose mission is to provide purposeful employment to vulnerable populations, especially ex-offenders and people with disabilities, who often suffer extreme financial and social exclusion because of those identities and the stigma, right, that is attached with those. Right? That should be familiar. Agape was actually started by an ex-offender himself, a man named Anil David, and he started it as a call center in Changi Prison in 2012. Anil's vision was because he had benefited from work that restored his dignity, that helped him be as a returning citizen back into society, and also work that helped him restore his relationship with his family. He wanted to provide that second chance for others. And so he created Agape, named it Agape, the Greek word for unconditional love. That through dignified work, ex-offenders, people with disabilities, others who are vulnerable and isolated can rebuild their lives. The achievements of Agape over a decade have been phenomenal. They now not only run a men's call center, they run a women's call center and a women's prison. Their recidivism rate of the people that come through their call centers and their work is 2% compared to a 20% average recidivism rate, right? It's a remarkable thing by any measure. They've won several awards from the Singapore government in recognition of their HR practices, as you can imagine. And of course, they've won several social enterprise awards. I think what strikes me as most interesting is the way that during COVID, you might think that prison call centers with great physical proximity during COVID was probably a bad idea. That challenged their model quite a bit. But the government of Singapore came to them with a novel idea and said, why don't you run the national healthcare hotline, mental health hotline? Because who better than ex-offenders and people with disabilities who know firsthand what it's like to be lonely and isolated, to be the people on the other end of the call? And it's been transformative. It's been transformative. So I've told you what I hope is a compelling story. But what's the role of venture philanthropy? Sorry, this is the slide on the hotline. So the venture philanthropy, I want to highlight a couple key takeaways. First is the high engagement dimension. So it turns out that when Anil was first getting going, he had a single call center, was trying to raise money from the government of Singapore, and was getting turned down. A friend turned him on to a Singapore businessman who had just become a philanthropist, who became interested, started talking with Anil and realized spending a lot of time trying to help Anil understand why were they not able to get grants? Why were they having a hard time sustaining the operation for such a good idea? He discovered that there'd been 2 call centers prior to Agape set up, but with a little bit of business know-how and a little business analysis, realized that they just had too few seats at the call center. They just had to expand from 20 to 50 seats to be profitable. So with that insight in him sort of walking arm in arm, that relationship, they discovered that they expanded the seats and they haven't looked back, right? So that non-financial role and relationship, high engagement relationship, was critical. Second, it has been from the beginning a story of blended finance, both philanthropic, public, and private, right? Co-invested in different ways. Again, that whole continuum of capital opening up. But first, because there were some key philanthropic players that believed in Anil, believed in the idea, helped to prove it out, and that those were able to leverage other kinds of funding. And third, and this will come up later, the patient and persistent nature of the investments. You probably have heard the term patient capital, where a typical foundation grant, at least in the States, is 1 to 3 years. If you're an investor, you're looking for a 5 to 8 year exit. This has taken over a decade of time. So patient and persistent capital is key, and I think venture philanthropy can play that. So the story of Agape shows how vital venture philanthropy has been in enabling this innovative and transformative social enterprise to figure out a viable model for itself and prove itself out and eventually become a self-sustaining social enterprise having great impact. I hope the story also illustrates the potential of venture philanthropy in addressing any number of challenges. But more than that, I believe venture philanthropy to be vital to addressing 3 critical realities of our world today. So let me return to the central argument, right? That addressing the world's most pressing challenges, especially for the people and places who need it the most, requires a special approach to capital, the kind of capital that philanthropy is uniquely suited to offer, that approach. And there's 3 particular benefits or powers or talents of venture philanthropy: the power of strategic capital, the power of catalytic capital, and the power of tenacious capital. And let's take each in turn. So first, we're all well aware that we don't struggle with any one challenge. They all interlock. They are all interconnected in sometimes quite scary ways. And the venture approach is well, we need capital, right? That isn't just trying to fight one of these issues as if they are separate and isolated from the others. In fact, so much of the philanthropic funding of the last 30 years has been so focused on programs on this issue or that issue that it is just it's not adequate for the kinds of challenges we face today. We really need an approach that is equal to the interconnected nature of these challenges. And this is where I'll argue that the power of strategic capital, the strategic power of venture philanthropy comes in. Say this another way: the complex and compounding nature of our challenges requires an approach to capital that can support innovative solutions with systems-level impact. A venture philanthropy approach enables capital to be strategic in a couple of different ways. It can be more agile and pioneering and exploratory because it has more autonomy than public dollars and private capital can often. It can be more risk tolerant, so it can invest in an early stage of an operation like Agape to help it get proved out, to prove and refine its model that then can attract other dollars. And it can be more systems level focused, right? If all of our problems are interconnected, so too must our solutions be interconnected and synergistic. This is a profound need of our time. So let me tell you one of my favorite stories that comes from TBN Africa on that interconnected, synergistic way. This is the story of Sanergy and Fresh Life. So you may be aware that something like 2 billion people suffer from lack of access to basic sanitation, leading to all kinds of issues with water, obviously all kinds of illness and sickness. And Sanergy's mission is to provide sanitation systems that are affordable and accessible in some of the most poorest communities on the planet. They operate primarily within informal settlements, which, as you can imagine, sanitation is often not optimal. So they have created a business called Fresh Life, which puts these toilets into informal settlements. And there's an incredible story just around the Fresh Life toilets. But that's actually not the story I want to tell today. The story is what they do with all of the human waste. Are you ready for it? From poo to protein. What they have done is they've connected several different enterprises together into that interconnected synergistic stream, value stream, so that they've connected the entrepreneurs who run the Fresh Life toilets to the people that collect the waste. They've figured out 3 different product streams for the waste. One is fertilizer, not appetizing maybe, but it works. But they've also discovered that there is a way that they can use that human waste to develop high protein animal feed that is environmentally sustainable. Because they've teamed up with a team from MIT that has discovered that there is a certain fly, a soldier fly, that lays its larva in the human waste, that you can, then the larva of that fly can be turned into high quality protein, right? Venture philanthropy has made this possible at every point in that value stream. The Gates Foundation right now is investing a lot of money in making sure that the soldier fly solution in that stream is possible, because there's a lot of science behind that, right? And getting the conditions just right. None of that would have been possible without venture philanthropy. The second challenge, I'm assuming you're all quite familiar with the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. These remind us that the problems are not just compounding and interconnected, they are massive in scale. And the Sustainable Development Goals are there to help us realize that we have to address these problems at scale. Now, the challenge is, if you look at how much it has been estimated it will cost to address these challenges, these environmental and social challenges that the 17 goals talk about at scale, we're talking about $5 to $7 trillion. And at current estimates, we have about a $2 to $3 trillion shortfall. And when you look at what public dollars can do, government spending as well as philanthropic, even if we double the current amount, there's not enough. We have to bring in private capital. We have to bring in capital markets to close this gap. To put this in a little bit more perspective, there's that capital continuum that I've reversed the order from, now it's from right to left. To give you a sense of the scale of philanthropy to public dollars to capital markets, right? 2 things you can draw, 2 conclusions you should draw from this. The first is philanthropy is tiny in comparison, and that neither philanthropy nor public spending together can compete or compare with what capital markets can do if we can get them in the game. But it's also true, and this is the takeaway, that the more we can turn that gray into venture approaches to philanthropy, the more we can unlock the whole continuum of capital that's going to be needed to achieve the sustainability goals and other things. So I think it's really important to really, again, to hone in on the small but outsized possibility of philanthropy taking a venture approach. And this leads to what I will call the catalytic power of venture philanthropy, which allows us, again, not only to take on the interlocking and interconnected nature of our challenges, but the challenges at scale. A strategic approach allows us to invest in early stage enterprises and prove out models by using those blended finance unlocking different kinds of finance, whether that's a grant, whether that's a debt loan, whether that's equity investments. All of those things become possible. It allows to bring those dollars because it can de-risk. As you prove out a model by investing early, you can de-risk these organizations because they've worked out their operational model. They've figured out what their impacts are, and they can talk about those impacts in a grounded and evidence-based way. And again, they can mobilize those critical non-financial, it can catalyze those mission-critical non-financial resources. So let me tell you a story, another story from the TB in Africa world, the story of Lisa Kimbo in South Lake Medical Center. This is a great illustration of the catalytic power of venture philanthropy. Lisa and the South Lake Medical Center are located in Naivasha, Kenya, where it's a major flower growing region. So this is home to thousands of flower farms and flower farmers who often don't have access to high quality healthcare. And this has been Lisa's mission and the mission of South Lake Medical Center to make affordable and accessible healthcare, especially primary healthcare and especially maternal healthcare. Most of the workers are women. And so they have a hub and spoke model of primary care that serves around 50,000 people who are mostly low-wage farm workers. So here again, the power of venture philanthropy really shows the catalytic power that it can bring. So over here on the left is Inco Investments, the London-based Sumerian partners, and Johnson & Johnson. So this is the US-based pharmaceutical company. Have all come together and together invested around just under $1 million to create a new major and minor surgery that has a full maternal health clinic that's attached to it. And they've done this through mainly loans and some equity investments. So besides building out the physical capabilities of the clinic, again, I want to come back to catalyzing not just the financial wealth, but the non-financial. So Johnson & Johnson Ventures has a program across its entire global workforce that people who work for Johnson & Johnson can take time and get paid to go be seconded at places like this. And so, in fact, many have come, they've taken time to bring their expertise, their subject matter expertise, to help build the capacity of the leadership team, which again, help them figure out their operational model from the medical side to the business side. And it's been transformative for this clinic. The last, or at least let me give one last reason for the first point of my argument about why the world needs this approach to capital. And that has to do with what's often known as the missing middle. So if this is new to you, in international development terms, when you compare high income and low income countries, one thing jumps out at you. When you look at high income countries like here or the States, you notice that the primary makeup of the economy, 90% of the economy is made up of small and medium-sized enterprises. That's the SME there, small and medium-sized enterprises. These are not huge corporations. These are between 20 and a few hundred people per enterprise. 90% of the business and around 70-ish% of the workforce is here. You could argue that this is the Main Street economy of developed countries. When you look at low-income countries, what do you notice, right? You notice that there's a lot on the micro side, the very small side, and some large businesses. But that key, important economic engine that employs most people, that supplies most of the prosperity in a country, remember the good quality and stable jobs, that comes from that middle. And it turns out that especially in what are often referred to as frontier and emerging markets, it's really hard to get the funding to go to these places. So this is really important. And COVID has only made this more acute, right? As we all can imagine. And this is where I think the final talent or benefit of venture philanthropy comes in. What I'm going to call the power of tenacious capital. And I use that word more than just patient capital, because it is patient, but it's also persistent. It's patient, persistent for the long haul. in challenging contexts. So you're investing in long time horizons. Remember, not 1 to 3 year cycles, not the 5 to 8 exits, often a decade or plus in time and investment of walking alongside somebody in partnership. It's persist in some very challenging and adverse contexts where this is not easy to do. It just is not easy to do. And again, you're walking alongside in partnership. And I think that reciprocity of partnership is important. So my favorite example is this gentleman, a guy named Kim Tan, who actually lives in Guilford. Kim is an incredible story of his own. Is a guy originally from Malaysia, grew up in quite poor circumstances, came to the UK on a scholarship, went to school here, became, I think, a chemist, did well, commercialized some of his research, and found himself in a position to be a philanthropist. He tells the story of going on a couple of trips where large NGOs would bring him, right, to certain places, and he was on maybe his 3rd round of one of these trips, and he realized that as much philanthropy as he was giving in the traditional sense, nothing seemed to be changing. And he was frustrated, and he was thinking about the difference between where he grew up in Southeast Asia and other places in the world where he was being asked to give. And he noticed that, that really in Southeast Asia, the key engine were forms of investment, of foreign direct investment, that were so pivotal in changing those economies. And so this was years before the Rockefeller Foundation coined the term impact investing. Kim found himself moving his philanthropy in that direction. And where it began was with an opportunity he had in South Africa, where he was giving a lot of philanthropy, to build a game park. He had 2 interests in building the Kazuku game park. One was social impact. This was one of the poorest areas in South Africa, but could we also use this to drive environmental conservation? And this is where what he set out. But he knew. But the reality is, it took over 20 years to see the impact that Kim had here, because there were a handful of real questions as he started out. First, right as he began to invest, the country went into some serious political uncertainty and turmoil that made the local currency tank. And so all of his wealth advisors were saying, "What are you doing? Do not invest anything here. You'll lose it all." And the second challenge was all of the land that he was beginning to consider investing in had been degraded for years and years of bad farming techniques. And so his ability to attract the big 5, the elephants and the lion and others for his game park, he didn't know if they would come. He didn't know if he could reclaim the land. And then on top of it, it was just outside the normal safari park region, if you will. He didn't know if he built a 5-star resort, would people come? But he knew that this region had very few economic anchors, and he believed over time, this is a kind of tenacity with faith involved, he believed that over time, this could be an economic anchor. It could supply real measurable social impact and environmental impact as well. Today, they have restored over 40,000 acres of land. They have reintroduced endemic species, including all the big 5. And they've also bred. That was another question. Would they actually breed if they brought them back? They have conserved 3 endangered species. And they are now reforesting with a crop called spec boom, that they're also now doing a ton of carbon set-offs and trading around. And they've just got a massive investment around that. The social impact has also been important. Over 100 different jobs have been created, and of course those ripple to the families of the people for stable income. And they've done a lot of work in providing stable housing, on-the-job training, career and vocational counseling, a whole range of things that have made it a really terrific thing. But again, here the story of Kazuku and the story of Kim's involvement is one of tenacious capital. It took 6 years to purchase all of the properties, the parcels, and to put them together. It took another year and a half to do the elephant fencing around all of this land. It took a few years to build the lodge. It took, I think Kim says overall, it took around 18 to 20 years of his relationship. Now he told me the other day, he said, I get to go and just enjoy it now as a tourist. But it took all of that time and that commitment on his part. And so this is what I would call the tenacious power of venture philanthropy. So I hope that these brief descriptions and illustrations are enough to at least, if not convince you, make you more interested in how impactful an adventure approach to philanthropy can be and why our world needs it. And by the way, here are some other pictures of the elephants and the cheetah that have been reintroduced. Now, the second point of my argument is quick to make. Even though that gray box, if you remember on that slide of philanthropy, was small in comparison, there is still a lot of money available for philanthropy to play this role. You may be aware that we're undergoing a massive transition in wealth that's estimated, it's a broad estimation, but it's a lot of money, right? Somewhere between $38 and $68 trillion. Of that, they're expecting 12 trillion of that to go to philanthropy over the next few decades. $12 trillion in philanthropy. Right now, there's $234 billion sitting in what are called donor advised funds, which means you can make a contribution to a DAF, as it's known, get your tax write-off, and it can just sit there until you're ready to deploy it somewhere. And if we actually look at the amount of money that's in the principal endowments of foundations today, which you can use for this sort of thing, there's another $1.5 trillion. So there is ample philanthropy that can be moved or converted into a venture approach. I want to close by saying that I think there are a couple challenges to this. If we unpack that gray box, I would say that while it's been a hot topic in some circles, especially large foundations who are connected to international development and those sorts of concerns, it still very much is an early adopter moment for venture philanthropy. There's still a lot of philanthropy that is waiting to be brought into the fold. I think there are 3 gaps that need to be closed if we're going to have success in moving more philanthropy in this direction. There's the evidence gap, what I'm going to call the enabling environments gap, and an imagination gap. And I put all these here even though I know the theme of this lecture series is about evidence. I think it's important to realize that you can still create a lot of evidence and not convince people or move people. Just think of climate change, all right? You need evidence, but it's not enough on its own. It's necessary but not sufficient. And these together, I think these 3 are critical. So just very briefly, on the evidence gap, this will not be a surprise to people in this room or on the live stream, I would imagine. There's a lot of talk about impact, lots of talk. You go to anybody's website, lots of talk about impact. Just how much impact evidence there is and what counts as evidence is a lot more shaky. Kiva, the online investing platform that some of you may be familiar with, did a survey of all of their investees and found that 60% of them do not have adequate evidence to support their claims. Major pension funds, who we really want in this game, right? They control a massive amount of wealth. 68% in the world say they don't have enough data and reporting as a limit on their ability to participate in impact investing. And I love this last one. So GIN, which is the Global Impact Investors Network, has done a bunch of internal surveys on its membership and found that only between 1% and 3% report underperformance. Now, for something that can be as difficult as some of the stories that I've just told you, that should be an alarm bell, which means that there's all kinds of impact washing. And not because people are trying to cook the books, it's that it's really hard to do. And they know that the funders are demanding this. So there's an incentive issue here that's as important. The good news is there is a growing field of impact measurement and management that's worth noting. There's lots of really interesting work being done. These are some of the names. There are other groups that are doing really important work and that I would encourage you to look at, trying to find, if you're trying to strengthen your evidentiary practice, I would also say that there's a growing consensus on some of the things that are happening here. Maybe we can get to some of that in the Q&A. The second gap is what I'm calling an enabling environments gap. So this means that if you want to do this, if you're inclined to do this, there are still high barriers to entry. So let's just take the question of having the capacity to do the evidentiary work that I just mentioned can be very expensive. I was talking to a few people in the TBN network that says, on average, if you hired an intermediary, a third-party validator to come and do the work for you, it can be up as much as $25,000 to do that work. And many social enterprises and nonprofits don't have that money. They don't have the staff that are qualified to do it. This is a great opportunity for venture philanthropy, and there are some increasing technical assistance funds that are doing it. Similarly, if you're a small family office, how do you know even where to begin? You yourself may not. You have money to give away, but you may not have the staff. And oftentimes you're struggling with figuring out, how do I even know where there is a pipeline? Where do I go to find deal flow, quality deal flow, places to invest our money? That takes a lot of effort, a lot of work to figure out. I'm not just going to give our money willy-nilly. We're going to take the time to do the due diligence and figure out how to walk alongside people. That takes time, that takes energy, that takes person power that lots of philanthropies simply don't have. And then there's the wider reality of just the wider enabling environments, the ecosystems that are often not present that support. So you invest in an organization, you walk alongside them, but what's the regulatory environment? What are the other realities, the rule of law, other kinds of things that are on the ground that are outside what you and an organization can control? I'll just point out that there is the way you deal with this is by investing in supporting ecosystems. And there are groups now that are realizing that we have to invest not only in a portfolio of social enterprises, but we have to invest also in the intermediary groups that are helping, the university research, the others that are around and supportive that make the work of an investment into a particular social enterprise sustainable and maximize the investment, the potential for impact in the world. This is just a slide that has the logos of the wider ecosystem in the TBN network to show just one example. And finally, the imagination gap. This is really critical. I think a lot of people stand on the other side and they still, because it's the only thing they know. When they think of philanthropy, they think of charity. They think, I'm going to write a check, I'm going to sponsor a child, I'm going to give my money to this organization and hope that they do good with it because I heard a really compelling story and it moved me, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. We want people to be philanthropic. We want people to be charitable. But if that's all they know, then they're leaving out that whole continuum, all the tools that I mentioned across that continuum of capital. They're leaving out if you're really driving towards impact and not just trying to make yourself feel good, you need to make those other kinds of tools, other forms of capital available, as well as non-financial, your human capital, your time. So I think shifting mindsets is really critical, and helping people do that is really a big part, not only the imagination, the evidence piece, but this piece. I think there are two ways that have typically proven to be successful. There's no magic bullet here, but I think one is telling stories that are responsible. I say inspire, but I also want to add responsible, because so much of telling stories can be just telling the thing that pulls your heart, right? That moves you as a fellow human being with empathy, but they need to be responsible in the sense that they need to be grounded as well. They need to be grounded in reality. They need to be honest. They need to be truthful. You need to talk about where you're underperforming. How important is it to a research community to actually talk about our failed experiments, right? That's just as important to knowledge building as our successes. And the ability for funders to allow their investees to say, you know what, that did not work. That did not work the way we thought it would, but now let's work together to figure out a solution is really critical. So stories that tell that story, I think would go a long way and would move people. And then finally, relationships that transform. I don't think there's any substitute than getting out of your office and going to go alongside on the ground in some kind of experiential relationship building way where you're walking alongside a social entrepreneur in the context of their work and seeing it on the ground. This is not writing a check and sending it in the mail, right, in the post. It's really being able to go down. So this is an example of Mana, which is an incredible social or environmental social enterprise based in Bali that has a vision to transform how we do tourism all across the island of Bali in Indonesia by creating a completely circular economy resort. It's beautiful, it's wonderful. And I kind of didn't believe it until I went to it. And I experienced it, I smelled it, I tasted it. I met the people there and the founders. So I think if we really want to close the imagination gap, we have to go. We have to be embodied in these places and walk alongside. So I hope with my remarks today that, again, I've moved you somewhat towards this notion that the world more than ever needs a special approach to capital that philanthropy with a venture approach is distinctively positioned to offer the world, that there is an ever-growing amount of philanthropy available for this, and that while there are barriers, they are overcomable, and that we each have something to contribute. And so that's what I'd like to close with. If you're a philanthropist, if you're sitting in this room, if you're somebody who's familiar with venture philanthropy, find a fellow philanthropist who's not. Build a relationship, invite them into your practice. If you are a philanthropist but have no experience with venture philanthropy, this is new, find an old veteran that you can go learn from. They're out there. There are also plenty of associations that are out there that you can go and be part of. If you are a researcher, a scholar, goodness gracious, do the social enterprises and the venture philanthropists need you? We need your scholarship. We need think about partnering with a social enterprise on a grant to help them do their social impact evaluation work. Do a study that can actually help show whether or not their work is having impact in the world or not. If you are a concerned citizen, think about your own philanthropy, right? Your own dollars. Where do you give them? Who do you give them to? Give them to groups that are going to take a venture philanthropy approach if you want to make sure that you are being responsible in your own giving and having impact in the world. I think there's something we can each contribute. Thank you for allowing me to make the case to you. I look forward to question and answers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Josh, for such an interesting and engaging lecture and for sharing some truly inspiring stories and making such a compelling case for venture philanthropy. I'm delighted to invite my colleague Ranjit Majumdar, who's been monitoring the online audience, and he's going to share some of their questions. As Mike touched on earlier, we want to now invite questions both from our online audience and in this in-person audience. If you're in the room, please will you raise your hand, and then either Ruth or Liz will arrive with a microphone. Please do wait for the microphone before you speak, because then it will be picked up for the online audience. So if you're happy to do so, we'd be really grateful if you'd stand up and actually just introduce yourselves briefly. So do we have any questions in the room? Liz, thank you.
Hi, I'm Shamali. I'm currently a Master of Public Policy student here at Oxford. So I have two sort of interrelated questions. You can choose if you want to answer both or one. The first is, I think there's been a lot of critique of philanthropy having, disproportionate tell, especially in developing contexts of where money is going and what kind of programs are funded. So just wondering what your thoughts on that are. And the second is, I think in developing contexts, particularly where I'm from, so I'm from India, philanthropic giving is not as developed as it is in the States or in Europe or in UK. And I think your gaps are true, but I'm just wondering whether they play out differently in these developing contexts and what we can do to encourage local philanthropy more.
Terrific questions. Thank you. So I think let me take the last question first. I think we want to encourage local philanthropy. I think everyone has, as people develop wealth, have the opportunity, at really any level. I mean, you don't have to be what we would necessarily call a wealthy person to give. People who do not have lots of wealth give all the time, in fact, in remittances in all kinds of ways around the world. But as people do generate wealth, that becomes a opportunity to deploy wealth. And what I want to see happen is through where there already are well-established philanthropic traditions with lots of resources, what I want to see that wealth doing is effectively creating the transfer of wealth in ways that are equipping other places to develop their own wealth, right? And so, I'll give a story. My daughter, who is a very precocious young person, challenged me one day and said, what's the difference between what you're calling tenacious capital and dependency, like the money of aid dependency, because you're still talking about long time frames in unequal power relationships. And I said, yeah, there are. But I think the difference is that a venture approach, as opposed to a standard charity approach or an aid approach, at least there are power differentials, there are differences, but at least it provides the opportunity to have pathways out of dependency, to the pathways that create wealth, right, that allow that power relationship to equalize. Where I think in an only charity or only aid approach, there are no pathways for that. It creates cycles of dependency that are really hard to break. And that's where you get those entrenched power differentials that don't change. And I think what I want to see is those power differentials change. And what's the route to that? You asked me a first question, lost what it was.
It's just about philanthropy sometimes having outsized kind of disproportionate control over the types of programs that get implemented in contexts different from their own.
Yeah, there's no question, right? When people have a lot of economic resources and others are looking for those resources, the people with the resources get to decide what happens, right? I think there are a lot of efforts underway to bring the beneficiaries' voices into philanthropy. There are a lot of efforts underway to create more equitable philanthropic mechanisms for giving. And I would say that those would be the places to emphasize and to invest more heavily in. But you're right, there's no question.
Thank you. Ange, do you have an online
I
question?
do. Great question from online that I want to ask you, which is that a person who really appreciates the focus on strategic co-investment, patient and persistent capital, but these all depend on partnerships. It all depends on getting these groups working together. And what can be done more to kind of forge these kind of structured and deliberate partnerships to allow the delivery of these kind of longer term outcomes?
Yeah, great question. I would go back to the answer about enabling environments. I think creating ecosystems, and this is where you need philanthropy, it's mostly, to invest in the ability of there being groups that come together to create those kinds of partnerships. It can be really difficult without those supporting environments to create the conditions for not just one-off collaboration, but collaboration that can be sustained, that can be truly equal in a reciprocal, let's say, in the best, fullest sense of that word. So that would be my answer, is invest in the supporting ecosystems that create the conditions for collaboration.
Just to ask you a quick follow-up question, which is, who are the key change makers in those environments? I mean, obviously you want to get everyone to rise up kind of simultaneously, but is it the philanthropists? Is it the thinking of the nonprofits? Is the capital markets being ready for it? And you can't say all of them, right? So who are the real sort of change makers, the people that allow that environment to become enabling and to be built?
So I think I hate to give an equivocating answer, which is it depends. I have seen different ecosystems being catalyzed by different actors, right? I have seen occasions where it was a coalition of social enterprise leaders that came together, banded together around a particular issue that they were all concerned with. And then that drove the interest from the funding community, right? I've seen examples where funders have seen over and over again, we're spending money here on the same things, but all disconnected So let's bring those together. We'll say we will now fund, but the things we will fund have to be aligned and coordinated. So it's sort of, I can see different actors playing that kind of coordinating, orchestrating role. I don't think it is any number of people can play that.
Yeah, it's context specific.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, if we could take another question from the room. Just this gentleman in the second row.
Hi, my name's Paul Vallely. I wrote a book called Philanthropy from Aristotle to Zuckerberg, which took me about 6 years and came out a couple of years ago. I want to take you, I'm very interested and appreciative of some of the vocabulary you've used, but I want to challenge you about the reality of that. First of all, I think you've caricatured traditional philanthropy to make it a bit of a straw man against your venture philanthropy. It seems to me that there are two main traditions in philanthropy, which go back to the ancient Greeks or the ancient Hebrews. And one of them is essentially a top-down mechanism, and the other is a two-way mechanism. And if you study the history of philanthropy, you see these interweave and sometimes are more dominant, and we're in a phase where top-down philanthropy is far more dominant. It seems to me that the healthy relationship is to have a bit of the strategic, but also to have some of the reciprocal. You mentioned reciprocity and partnership. You talked about walking alongside, and you've acknowledged power differentials. All of those are really important. But it seems to me that the dynamics within what you're calling venture philanthropy really favor the power differential more so even than the traditional philanthropist. And that idea that somehow there will be a genuine partnership, I think is one which needs to be very closely scrutinized, because that's not my experience of it at all. And on one particular point, you mentioned donor-advised funds. And it seems to me that they are a particularly pernicious tool. Yes, they can enable great things to be done, but they're very opaque. They've been used by right-wing philanthropists in the States to do things like promoting voter disenfranchisement and things like that. So I don't see that donor-advised funds is a tool here. I admire your purpose, but I question some of the methods by which you've got to where you are tonight.
Yeah, thank you. And fair play. I want to read your book. Yeah, I mean, you use some words that I'd like to explore what you mean by reciprocal and top-down. Look, there's no question, I think, as the lady back there also asked, there are these power differentials, and I do think that a venture partnership, a venture philanthropic partnership with a social enterprise, it can be one where when you have such a it's like an overactive parent, right? Who's so engaged in their child's lives that it can be distorting, right? There's no question that can be the case. So I give you that. But I think I have seen enough examples of it where, in fact, the people giving the money are transformed in their relationship and partnership with the groups on the ground as well. So I've seen it work both ways. In that sense, I think it is reciprocal, or it can be. But I think you raised some very, very strong and good points, and we'll have to talk more later about them.
Do we have time for another question? Yes. Okay. So should we take the lady in the second row here, and then we'll go online.
Thank you so much for coming to Oxford. I really enjoyed your talk. My name is Isabella, and I'm an MPP student from last year and a current MBA student this year at Green Templeton. And I just wanted to ask for your comment a little bit about the role of venture philanthropy and the tension between evidence and a proof of burden to kind of demonstrate impact from these organizations, and the notion of investing in an organization instead of a program. Because most of the funding that is available for these organizations is typically restricted funding, right? It's for a particular program, for a particular purpose, tied to a particular impact measurement, and there isn't really unrestricted type funding or grants for things like core costs that are actually some of the most critical parts for an organization to function. So if you could comment a little bit about that tension and whether venture philanthropy is making that tension even more difficult for these types of organizations that are seeking out philanthropic funds, or if it is kind of alleviating that tension.
It's a great question. And so what I'll argue is venture philanthropy at its best, I think, actually provides the opportunity to reduce that tension. Precisely the way how you framed it, right? So many nonprofits, social enterprises are struggling to support their core operations, to figure out their operational model, to prove it out. But they're chasing, the way that they're doing that is a small percentage of overhead dollars for each grant. So they have to contort themselves around this grant or that grant with each, as you say, just sort of restricted funding for that particular purpose. And they're starved to be capitalized on really building out the capability of the enterprise itself. I think venture philanthropy, at least compared, and it may be a straw man to some extent, but I don't think it's that much of a straw man, given the way the philanthropic system works today, that when you come alongside an enterprise and you're actually giving your own expertise, making it available, giving cash that's not restricted, that is really helping build out the operational model, I think on the whole, those organizations are going to be much stronger and much more sustainable, and in the long run have much greater impact. That's at its best.
Ranj, I think we have time for one quick question.
Okay, I just want to take a question here which is talking about the applicability of the venture philanthropy model. And to think about, are you a kind of evangelist if you look at the SDG areas? Do you think that venture philanthropy has a significant role in all of them? Do you think there are some contexts where it just wouldn't work? I guess this is a question really about the limits of venture philanthropy.
All 17. I would need to think about that a little longer. I guess my quick answer is, yeah, sure, there are limits to what venture philanthropy is perhaps can do and maybe what it's really best at. And the thing that I know the best is it is good at investing in small and medium-sized enterprises, whether those are nonprofit or for-profit. That's what I think it's especially really well-equipped to do. I'm sure we could come up with some things that it's not very good at.
I'm truly sorry, but that has to bring the Q&A to an end. I'm sure there are many more questions out there that we'd love to explore. But right now, it's my pleasure to hand over to Pallavi, who's going to bring the evening to an end.
All right, well, good evening, and thanks again, everyone, and to the audience for your engagement, as well as our online audience. Dr. Yates, I want to express my sincere gratitude for your speech and for your presentation today about venture philanthropy and its benefits. So thanks for your sharing and responsible stories that you talked about on utilizing existing resources and how to overcome persistent barriers. It's clear that traditional philanthropy and government spending alone cannot tackle the challenges facing our world, and your call for a tenacious commitment to working together at the frontier of venture philanthropy is inspiring. So that does bring us to the end of our fantastic evening today. Thank you to Sir Michael Dixon, Carolyn Greenhalgh, Ranjit Majumdar, and to the entire GTC team for their support. Thanks again to Dr. Josh Yates for joining us today, and to the audience for your amazing questions. Have a great evening.